Okay, well, I don't know how to work PowerPoint, so it won't be in presentation mode, unfortunately, because I'm reading off of this screen, and I didn't think it would duplicate it, but here we are. Good evening. Welcome to my lecture recital. Thank you all for coming out. Throughout the course of this presentation, you'll have a better understanding of these two new works for euphonium and how to adequately prepare and present them, as well as a foundational understanding of electroacoustic music as it relates to euphonium. The title of my project here is A Performer's Guide to Two New Electroacoustic Euphonium Solos, and we'll be talking about Bitruncation by Lucy Pankhurst and Shapeshifter by Intermedia. As a little bit of foundation, so since the composition of Ponchielli's Concerto for Flacorno Basso in 1872, euphonium solo compositions flourished, expanding the instrument's repertoire across various mediums. Works like Gordon Jacobs' Fantasia and Horowitz's Concerto developed the euphoniumist's technical limitations beyond the expectations of the Golden Age. And the modern euphoniumist now has well over 1,000 works to choose from, all with varying modes of accompaniment. One such mode is the use of electronics. John Boda's Sonatina with Synthesizer, which was written in 1970, was the first euphonium solo to include electronics and introduce new timbral possibilities. Subsequently, numerous compositions featuring euphonium and electronics emerged, with the most significant portion after the U2000. These pieces often required heightened proficiency in technical understanding of electronics. Now, there have been documents written to assist performers in the digestion of these sometimes complicated, albeit worthwhile pieces. And while there's not been a study specifically on brass players' disinclination towards playing with electronics, these documents often make an uncited argument about the technical knowledge as a barrier towards getting musicians to dive in. Therefore, the purpose of this research is to create a performance guide to these two new electroacoustic solos, Bitruncation and Shapeshifter. These solos represent an evolution in the demand of the soloist's knowledge from basic playback tracks. Both works make use of a digital patch through the software Max, whose settings and manipulation are not immediately obvious to the performer and do warrant some explanation. Performers must be comfortable with the setup and operation of microphones, cables, audio interfaces, audio drivers, and the Max software to effectively perform these two works. So with the creation of this performance guide, it is my hope to give musicians a more accessible entry into the electroacoustic repertoire in order to further advance the creation and performance of these works. So the research and subsequent presentation is organized as follows. I will present a short history of electroacoustic music and the application Max, as well as some terms related to this project. There will then be a recap of the dissertations which serve as precursors, as well as an updated recommended repertoire list. The analysis of each work is broken into three sections, the first focusing on theoretical analysis, the second on an analysis of the electronic part, and the final section on performative considerations, techniques and ideas which I have found helpful that other performers may also. So, speaking about the electroacoustic repertoire, there are really three categories that these works are divided into in the current scholarship. The first being fixed media, which is the most prevalent style written for euphonium. Following World War II, there was a boom in electronic music composition, especially in Europe. Experimental music was being written for tape recorder. You may have heard in your music history classes composers like Pierre Schaeffer and Pierre Henry. The idea of an acoustic instrument performing a solo with a recorded tape part then was not a terribly distant concept. The first such work, as you can see on the screen here, which I get a little ahead of myself, Bruno Maderna's Musica su due dimensioni for flute, cymbals, and tape. Some of the first works specific to brass include Henrik Bodding's Chaconne for trumpet and electronics, and Jacob Druckmann's Animus I for trombone and electronics. Some of the, sorry, I already said that. Not far behind, Boda's Sonatina with Synthesizer, which was 1970, did not stretch the sound concept quite as far as Bodding's or Druckmann did, instead using counterpoint between the synthesizer and euphonium. The second category is referred to as live electroacoustic music. This involves the modification or interaction of sounds in real time using electronic means. So pieces like John Cage's Imaginary Landscape No. 1, which is as far back as 1939, Utilized recordings which were played on turntables and mixed with frequency recordings, cymbal and piano. During the late 50s and 60s, performers became able to electronically modify sound in real time using things like tape delay, filtering, ring modulation, panning, and phasing, among other techniques. And a lot of these allowed performers different sonic options than the fixed media pieces. These analog processes were gradually replaced by computer processing in the 1970s and 80s. With the development of digital signal processing throughout the 80s and the increase in power of microprocessors, computers became capable of transforming the timbral and temporal elements of a piece in real time. This opened the door to the third type of electroacoustic music, interactive, in which the computer part is treated more like another performer and has the capacity to modify elements of the work based on real-time analysis, often with elements of improvisation. So Philip Manner's Jupiter, for example, is able to track the performer's pitch to allow the performer to control the flow of time. Because there are subtle differences in the performer's pitch on each performance, or what the microphone will pick up in a different space, the computer part will react differently for every performance. This means that interactive electroacoustic music can provide a performer greater freedom to be expressive and collaborate with the computer. However, this increased sophistication and demand for consistency require a higher degree of preparation and improvisation in response to unexpected electronic events, which is sort of true with all of it. So these live and interactive electroacoustic works often require specialized hardware or software. Looping, filtering, and delay, as mentioned previously, can be accomplished through analog guitar pedals, which you may have seen people play with, or via a digital system. Hardware like pedals typically have less delay than digital analysis, which can be a major hurdle for some works. However, pedals can have a pretty wide range in price, and getting all of the components needed for one or multiple pieces can really drive up the performer's expense list. So a digital system is more economical, but performers can find the digital delay troublesome depending on the work. Many live and interactive works have patches included with the piece and can be run on a free copy of Max or other software like Clear So Max, the software that both of these two pieces use, was built by Miller Puckett, a researcher at UC San Diego and formerly at EarCam. The program is named in honor of Max Matthews, who is an electronic music innovator, worked at Bell Labs from the 1950s onward. And Puckett describes Max way better than I can. People sometimes ask me about it, and I just direct them to the quote. But, quote, as a way of combining pre-designed building blocks into configurations useful for real-time computer music performance. It's like code. Composers and performers can build systems which allow them to do nearly any type of digital signal processing, graphic manipulation, MIDI control, and even web application control. Because there are so many possibilities with Max, a laptop is a much more versatile and compact tool for a performer than analog electronics. So in addition to Max, there's a couple of other pieces of hardware that performers would need to know. So let me give you those and some quick definitions, many of which you may or may not already be familiar with. A laptop, that one you should know. Dynamic microphone, hold up here. So a dynamic microphone, which you can see up here, is a type of mic with generally higher durability and lower quality, good at capturing a small area of sound. This is a Shure SM57, which is a relatively inexpensive and kind of workhorse mic. So where sound is being processed, this works really well. A mic stand, a audio interface, which up here is your little red box. I'm using a Focusrite. This communicates the microphone signal to the computer via USB. For most of the stuff that we do for Euphonium, two inputs and outputs is enough. So this is a Focusrite. You can also use a Steinberg. Generally, an interface will come with drivers, which you might need to get installed and make sure that it's cross-platform, Mac or PC. XLR cables, which are these ones up here, used for microphones and some other stuff. Interfaces, mixers, it's the one with 3 pins. And 1/4-inch cables, or the instrument cable, instrument jack, TRS cable, that connects your interfaces, mixers, headphones, and more. And there will be a diagram a little bit later about how all this stuff works, but it looks pretty. A MIDI USB pedal, which is down there, like one that you find on a digital piano, can be connected to the computer via USB with a specialized adapter, and you can send MIDI messages to the computer. A mixer, which in this system is back there because we're using the MEIT, adjusts the levels of audio signals and sends it out to the speakers, and the speakers, which are all around us, put sound out in the hall. Some of them have a self-contained power unit, so if you're traveling, just make sure you know whether or not your speaker needs to be powered. Now, discussing the foundational research for this project, like I mentioned, since the year 2000, and really especially since 2010, there have been a number of live electroacoustic works added to the repertoire. Their dissemination has been aided by dissertations and research projects focused on documenting the repertoire, and there have been a growing number of performers commissioning works. The earliest dissertation on the repertoire for euphonium and electronics was titled Original Compositions for Solo Euphonium with Tape, written by Neil Corwell in 1997. And most of us probably know the name, but Dr. Corwell is one of, if not the largest contributor to the body of work for euphonium and electronics. However, almost all of his works rely on fixed media accompaniments and use recordings of MIDI sequences, which performers play along to. Many of these works are really effective as a recital or concert piece, as long as your electronics are balanced well and the performer can synchronize effectively. Because performance with live or interactive electronics require more intense technical knowledge, several dissertations from 2017 made considerable contributions with their discussion of performance practice for electroacoustic works. The first is Danielle Van Tynen's paper titled Euphonium and Live Electronics, a Performer's Examination of 3 New Works, and Irving Ray's dissertation titled A Comprehensive Performance Guide for the Use of Advanced Technology in Euphonium Repertoire with Electronic Media through Analyses of Works by D. Edward Davis, Neil Corwell, and Lucy Pankhurst. These assess new compositions for euphonium and electronics. Van Tynen spotlights Grant Jan's Petrichor, Brett Copeland's Warrior, and Justin Rito's Zero Circle, while Ray discusses Let There Be Funk by D. Edward Davis, Fantasy on Night by Neil Corwell, and Susurration by Lucy Pankhurst. Both documents introduce electronic elements with historical context and technological explanations, as well as biographical insights, ideal setups, and performer-focused analyses of each piece. Ray also discussed hardware and software terminology, ideal setup, safety considerations, and device operation, noting that there are, quote, 65 solos that use electronic media at the time of writing. He compiled them all in an appendix, which included 36 works not included in the euphonium source book. This was a good step up. The repertoire list created by Dr. Ray has become foundational in the creation of a new subset of the repertoire, and interest has only grown in recent years. In Brett Keating's 2020 dissertation titled Contemporary Euphonium Repertoire Project, Electroacoustic Works Database and Selected Works Performance Guides, he compiled much of the information from the previous 2 writings to a helpful primer for performers looking to expand the repertoire to include electronics. As a side note, for any of you looking to do that in the euphonium world, I would start with his. Dr. Keating does a really good job of making it kind of idiot-proof to start up with what you need and how it works. So I have now compiled the lists from Dr. Ray and Keating's dissertations to create a new repertoire list. So in addition to the inclusion of publication information, which was missing from Dr. Keating's document, I've also included works that are originally for other brass instruments or are brass agnostic, that work well on euphonium or could be adapted. I've also included a section of works which are no longer performable, either from asking the composer and they don't have access to the part, or the materials have been lost, or the composer is inaccessible and the work isn't published. And that list, which we won't go through, but looks a lot like this. And I think I'm at about 156 works, which is quite a bit more than the last time this was updated. And so I'm hoping that that will be a really helpful resource for anybody looking to explore new music. Now, the pieces that I'm discussing tonight, the first one is Bitruncation by Lucy Pankhurst. Dr. Pankhurst is an award-winning English composer who specializes in brass band writing and innovative solo works. Among other accolades, she was the first female composer to be presented with a British Composer Award in the Brass and Wind category in 2011 for her work in Pitch Black, which was the first brass band work to win such an award. Dr. Pankhurst has been commissioned for large-scale projects like the Durham International Brass Festival, a residency at IWBC, a PRS Foundation-funded work for brass band and electronics in 2013, and other works for high-profile ensembles. Her first work for euphonium and electronics was written in 2014, entitled Susurration, which was mentioned on one of the previous dissertations. It was premiered by Dave Thornton on a Salford University lunchtime concert series, the recording of which is on YouTube. You can find that. Bitruncation is her second work for euphonium and electronics and represents a pretty significant change in style and demand from susurration. So the mathematical concept of a bitruncation is where the original edges of a polyhedron are lost, creating a new shape. This is achieved by blunting each corner until new corners are created. So as you can see in this image up here, if you take a cube and you keep sanding down all its corners, you get a 8-sided polyhedral. And when you sand down that 8-sided polyhedral, you get a smaller cube. The melody of this piece, therefore, is constructed from random rolls of dice. The first and third sections were based on the rolls of a D6, that is a 6-sided die, and the middle section's melodies were based on an 8-sided die, or D8. On the die, each of the vertices and edges were labeled on this exploded map, which you can see right here, which were then constructed into tables, which you can see here. So the numbers from the tables were used in reference to a chromatic scale in order to form pitch class sets. So a number 1 would be a C, all the way up through 12, which would be a B. For instance, the first roll on the D6 on the top table here, it was a 4. And if we reference this past picture, you can see the edges are 6, 8, 10, and 12, listed right here. And the edges were 2, 4, 6, 8. The next slide are tone rows which have come out of those rolls. The whole notes there are the number rolls, and the 8th notes are the edges and vertices. And when we're talking about the numbers on this table, as you can kind of see, if we're talking about the number roll, that's going to be this sequence here. So 4, 6, 2, 1, 3, 5. The same thing for the D8. The number roll is going to be 8, 1, 2, 3, 6, 4, 5, 7. And then the corresponding edges and vertices are just labeled as, this set of numbers is going to be called 4E. This set would be 3B, so on and so forth. So in the work, the first page, or the first cube, begins with 4 6-measure loops. And as you can see from the graphic here, the pitches are derived from the number rolled on the table, which would be 4, 6, 2, 1, 3, 5, and adds 2 for a numerical set of 6, 8, 4, 3, 5, and 7. Translated in pitch, you get F, G, E flat, F, D, E, and F sharp. And all of this is in B flat treble clef and referred to as the notes that they're written as. There is a bass clef version, but as part of the British brass band scene, this was, I get a little bit more comfortable, and I don't have a problem reading in treble clef, so it just worked out that way. So the subsequent loops here are using the number rolled -1, and then again the number rolled with a different rhythm, and this last pitch, this final F here added. So after these 4 loops are created, the 6-measure sequence repeats once as the patch sort of digitizes the sound by adding distortion and bit crushing. And then the soloist moves on to melody 1. So melody 1 is 12 measures long, and the melodies in this piece stray a little bit further from the tone rows. But inspiration from the tone rows and the important intervals, which she lists in the program notes, can be found throughout. Those important intervals are octaves, sixths, 12ths, and 4ths. So as you can see here, the melody 1 begins with the corresponding edges from number 4 on the table. So 4E, you add 2 to that, and you get the pitches for this first bar. Second bar is going to be the 4th row of vertices plus 2. And then there's this kind of interesting sequence that almost mirrors 6E, but has this shrinking sequence of -1, half step, -6, half steps, and then -1, -5, -1, -4, which comes back later as well. So you can see from the rest of this graphic where a lot of those rolls and intervals come in. The pink is going to be intervals. The little kind of wavy brackets with colors are rolls. And if they're a similar color, they're kind of related. So blue is going to be 4 of some type, either B or E. Green is going to be 6, and so on and so forth. So following the performance of melody, the performer rests for the same duration to, again, let that digitize. The final part of the first page is the activation node, which represents the blunting of the D6's edges to create your intermediate polyhedron D8. Soloist performs harsh strikes on a single pitch, which is duplicated loudly in several octaves by the patch. Upon the final sforzando attack, the patch loops the sound as an echo, reverberating and beginning the 18-count pause before the loops begin in the next section. And each subsequent section follows the same form: layering loops, rest, melody, rest, and activation node. Each section changes time signature and varies phrase length to represent the mathematical process of the piece's namesake. So to skim quickly through here, on the second page, the octahedron, the time signature is changed to 6/8, but the pulses remain the same. The 4 loops here, again, mostly utilize the number rolled, except for this last one, which you see utilizes each edge and vertice in order as their material. And then here is a representational analysis of the melody. So following that layer loops, we get the second melody, and these have a lot of kind of similar logic, I suppose, to how the first one was organized. And then on the third and final page, we get our second cube, which is slightly smaller, so the phrases are shorter, but we have moved back to 4/4. You can again see the influence of the pitch sets here. All of these are constructed from the number rolled. Only weird thing is on this fourth loop 12, the first 2 pitches are switched, I think, for playing cohesion. And then we get to the final page's melody, which has a really similar sequence to the first page. So we start with 4E and 4V, this time -2. There's that same 6E sequence with the descending or shrinking interval pattern. And something really clever in this final melody is the use of the sforzando notes as their own tone row. So starting, you can see here on the second line, each sforzando note is part of the roll for the 2 edge, and then Following that is the 2 vertices. There are a couple almost intervals, which I had questions about that I have not yet asked, but you can see on the top line here, there's one that is almost 5E. The B sharp would have to be a B natural, and then almost 5E again, the E would have to be an E flat or D sharp. So that is how the melody goes, and that's what we can expect. Let's take a look at the patch. So the patch can be launched as a standalone executable file, a collective file in Max, or a Max file opened on a runtime copy. As you can see, there are a few elements that may not be totally obvious. The first in the top left is this ADC. That is your input, and performers can double-click that to open up audio settings, which you can read about if you're interested. The dry in, out, and loop out control the gain levels coming into and out of the patch. Adjusting the dry in will get your signal louder throughout the rest of the patch. Dry out is your sound coming out through the speakers, and then loop out is basically everything else. The patch is started by pressing the space bar, as highlighted in yellow here, and the loop progress bar ticks along from left to right. So in that way, it follows maybe a little bit more like a fixed media piece in that it goes from start to finish, but there is still live processing happening. So the player should follow this loop progress bar for the pulse of the piece until they can follow along orally. And at the end of each activation node, there's about 18 beats of silence. So again, that's an easy visual cue to follow along. So the following conclusions I've made in the study of this piece that may be helpful to future performers, and potentially with other similar electronic works too. The first is actually regarding this loop progress bar. Performers should follow it on kind of the front side of the beat, or tend to be a little ambitious with their time. The metronome is slightly delayed from the data processing due to the monitor's refresh rate. So if you find yourself playing in the middle or behind the beat, by the time the next loop comes around, you may be late and your loops will be sort of off. Similarly, clear attacks are really important when the loops are being recorded. So I almost think about these as a sforzando or some kind of forte piano so that we can hear the front of the note in almost a percussive way, like a bell tone, which allows for more rhythmically involved loops to be heard once everything is finally layered up. During the activation nodes, the performer should use the hardest articulation available to them. The patch does add a little bit of distortion to help create a different type of sound, but it is necessary to tongue hard to create a percussive effect. And I find it really hard on euphonium not to sound too friendly during this section. Also related to the activation nodes, the performer should be sure to stay really strictly in time, especially on the final attack. The last eighth note must come before the final beat to ensure it's properly looped, and you may even consider lengthening it and putting it a little early, holding on until the loop progress resets. And in the octahedron section, all dynamics are marked lower than the cube pages. The filtering and distortion levels are also really different, so performers should take this opportunity to create a different texture by playing software and with a little more smoothness. Last element of this is the stage setup. So this represents the ideal stage setup for bitruncation. As you can see, and as you will see, I suppose, you should stand near the microphone, which is on the mic stand, maybe half a meter above the bell, pointed directly into it. That is plugged into the interface here via XLR cable. Laptop and interface are connected and should be positioned to the performer's left, which is not something you necessarily think about, but with your bell in the way, it becomes pretty obvious pretty quickly when you're trying to follow a visual cue. The interface is plugged into the laptop via USB and is set through Max as the input and output. you can see here the interface is running two quarter-inch jacks out to the mixer, which is back here, and then goes back there, which sends the signal to the hall speakers. There's a lot of variations on this setup, including there's a little arrow you can see going from the laptop to the performer. In a hall that is not this one, it may be beneficial to have some kind of headphones so that you can follow along better aurally, or use of a stage monitor. If your microphone, God forbid, is USB instead of using an interface, then this will look a little bit different, but that's the idea. Regardless, it's recommended that performers carry multiple types and lengths of cable, especially when performing in new locations, and it is always best practice to get into the hall before a performance to set up and test levels, which we have hopefully done. So without further ado, I'm going to flip over to the speaker setup, and I hope you enjoyed this performance of Bitruncation. I did premiere this at the South Central Regional Conference last week, but I guess that makes this a Texas premiere. Move back over. Looks like a charm. Okay, so the second piece that we'll be discussing is Shapeshifter by Andrew May. Dr. May is currently the Associate Professor of Composition at University of North Texas College of Music and was the longest serving director of UNT's Center for Experimental Music and Intermedia, CEMI. Dr. May has a great breadth of experience with interactive computer music and catalog of such works that begins with the Twittering Machine for Flute and Computer all the way back in 1994. Shapeshifter is Dr. May's first work for euphonium electronics. The work is designed to imitate the ways folk songs transform and are reinterpreted and recontextualized throughout different eras and cultures. The foundation for of the material for the work is taken from multiple versions of the 17th century folk song, known variously as The Cruel Mother, Down by the Greenwood Sidey, Fine Flowers in the Valley, and a whole slew of other names. This folk song has had many iterations, with some sources counting over 300 versions of the lyrics and melodic notes. There are multiple opportunities for the performer to act as a curator of these different variants on the folk songs through a variety of open notations in the score. And by choosing and recombining different elements, the performer creates a combinatorial original version to which the computer responds flexibly in performance. So the work begins with church bells and a tempura drone from the computer, which is constructed from digitally shifted recordings of the euphonium created during composition. The performer contributes to the drone with multiphonics, then enters the first aleatoric section at Q2. So here the melody fragments are laid out in open notation and are taken from Joan Bay's version of Pre-Recital. So here are the melody fragments, and here is melody transcription, which has been put in the original, or this key. So the performer has roughly 60 to 80 seconds on this aleatoric segment, after which the foot pedal should be pressed and Q3 should be played. It's really helpful to stay in time by listening to the church bells and drums, which cycle every third measure. The performer does not necessarily have to adhere to the strict 3/4 time because of the variability between breaks between fragments, but should rather focus on staying in pulse. The final line of the first page is the first strictly melodic material. It ends on a D drone with the performer singing an A, then listening to a G. Each page similarly begins or ends with such a multiphonic drone. At the beginning of page 2, the tempo accelerates from 48 to 66. The key signature additionally changes, and the title, Smile So Sweet, reflects the inspiration from the Red Hat's version of the Rose and the Lindsay. So you can see up top here the melodic inspiration and how that was used in the melody. The euphonium part plays a modified version of the first phrase twice, then shifts into G Dorian and ends the page with another open fifth multiphonic. Throughout this page, the performer should keep track of the drum part to stay in time and listen to the euphonium samples occurring in the background. The samples are strictly in time, but often offset in the meter, resulting in canonic imitation. On page 3, titled You'll Smile Me Dead, draws inspiration from M.J. Harris and Martin Bates' version of The Cruel Mother, the melody of which is played in direct transcription halfway through the page in the computer part, which you can see right here. The tempo and key signature do not shift on this page, but the key changes to A minor, and intensity is instead built through the performer's interplay of more volatile melody fragments, which form complex tuplet-based composite rhythms with the drums. The euphonium additionally plays a double role by itself. There are moments of rapid dynamic change where the euphonium switches from a soft whispering tone to a projected and anguished singing quality. The rolling of the drums and volatility of the soloist represent the growing tension of the song as the lyrics forebode the murder of the titular cruel mother's children. The page ends with a whispered melodic fragments and a multiphonic which crescendos into fortissimo as the drum rolls and crashes, entering the final section of quicker tempo and highest intensity. On the final page, the tempo is again increased now to 78. The time signature remains unchanged, but the key is returned to D Dorian. The computer part is also much busier, with imitation of the melody in both computer and drum parts. And the soloist similarly imitates the melody, now drawn from Tim Erickson's The Pre-Recital. After playing through this transcription of the melody, the performer again has aleatoric options laid out for them in open notation. They should again stay in time with pauses between phrases. It is important also to remain at the correct dynamic, as this both impacts the computer part and retains intensity until the end of the work. At last, the fortissimo multiphonic rips up to a high trill on the F, which ends the piece. The patch for shapeshifter is significantly more complex and has a lot of information which may not be immediately obvious. The player should try to read this patch like they would a book, starting with the top left and working their way down. So just, a lot of stuff in here is the same as the Bitruncation patch, but to give you an idea of how they differ, we'll just kind of run down a few of these. The top left here, we have utilities, which takes a different approach. The pink button sets up your audio, as opposed to the other patch where you have to double click. The blue button sets up your MIDI pedal, And both of these have sub-patches which contain pretty foolproof information to get them working right. The next section is audio input, which allows you to choose your mic source and set the input level. Following that, the input tracking segment has the euphonium threshold, which effectively zeroes the scale as audio is playing to ensure that sound coming from the speakers of the monitor doesn't get picked up and feedback. Output signal mixing is your one-stop shop for allowing the performer to balance all of the sounds coming out of the patch. So the euphonium level, as you're playing it, the computer level, and a reverb balance, reverb gain, and then a kind of master output gain. In the bottom left, there are several buttons which control the flow of the piece. So there is a scope to start at a different cue, which really helps with practice. The MIDI pedal or spacebar or clicking the yellow button starts the piece. And all of this can be done with the pedal or the keyboard or mouse or other shortcuts. Final section in the bottom right here is the timekeepers, which contains flashing metronomes for bar and beat, which is helpful to look on for the aleatoric stuff. There's also numbers to keep track of tempo and meter, as well as total time elapsed. I find that the beat is much more helpful than the bar in most cases. And the time within cue bar is really helpful for kind of gauging your time within each aleatoric section. So these following remarks are performative suggestions for Shapeshifter, which are hopefully helpful. As you probably saw, one of the kind of themes throughout is the use of multiphonics, both above and below the pitch. And I find this really difficult. I'm pretty used to singing above the pitch, but I found it most helpful to practice by beginning on a pretty moderate pitch, so middle of the staff F, and then attempting to sing a fourth or fifth below. F is a pretty stable note, so even if it bends, it may not break while you're trying to maneuver the voice in there how you want it to be. While selecting aleatory, performers are instructed to play their choice of fragments, and they need not play all of them or in any specific order. So the number following each bar is the total number of times each fragment can be played. Some suggestions to organize these fragments are as follows. You could begin and end with fragments which may be played only once. Begin and end with the same fragment, i.e. a fragment which could be played 2 or 3 times. Play several in a row which end on the same pitch or exist in the same harmony. Organize fragments by ascending or descending final pitch. Organize by ascending or descending dynamic. Play several of similar rhythmic complexity before changing. Or organize by which techniques they use. So start with multiphonics, move to flutter tongue, and then to rips to create increasingly or decreasingly complex texture. And the setup difference is nearly identical to that for bitruncation, so I did not include it in the presentation. The key differences are the inclusion of the MIDI pedal and the potential use, like I had said, for a stage monitor instead of a headphone, or in this case, the monitors are fundamentally all around you. Alternatives to a pedal could possibly include some kind of wireless clicker, which you may have seen people using for swiping through music. That might have some delay that might be unfavorable, or pressing the space bar, having somebody else press the space bar, doing that remotely. You have a lot of options. So please enjoy this performance of Shapeshifter as I shift back over there. one last time. Before I kind of dive into this conclusion, I wanted to say thanks to all of you for coming out, to my committee for being here on Tuesday night, and also helping me throughout all of my studies. I feel like I've been here a long time, but I feel like I've learned a lot, so I really credit it to all of you. Just to wrap up here, the two studied works are part of this growing trend of live and interactive electroacoustic music for solo euphonium. This music has the opportunity to share new soundscapes and connect with diverse audiences, which I believe can elevate the euphonium as a solo instrument in new contexts. It's my hope that this research inspires future soloists to perform these pieces, and that in turn inspires the creation of more innovative electroacoustic works. Some further research that I'd like to suggest or potentially do came to mind while I was working on this project. As with many contemporary electroacoustic works, these pieces have a little bit more scope for life than their traditional counterparts. Patches and even sheet music can change with each performance to better suit their audience. During the composition of Bitruncation, Dr. Pankhurst mentioned the possibility of having performers make their own dice rolls, which would then inform a unique version of the piece. So whether this would be done prior to study or at the beginning of the performance would be up for debate, but I would really be interested in seeing a version in sort of a blank template in which the performer can input their dice rolls, and this would populate number tables, and a patch could fill in and notate a unique version of the piece. This would result in a huge number of possible versions, and each would be very personal to the performer. The next suggestion I had regarding future research has to do with the updated repertoire list. As most of you are probably familiar, the ITEA, International Tuba Euphonium Association, has a published list of standard works for euphonium and tuba on their website, but this list does not yet have a category for electronics. I'd like to see a more comprehensive web-based list of electroacoustic works, which could be community-driven potentially and have all of the necessary publication, difficulty, and electronics information. As I've tried to do, mine is a PDF, so it'll be relatively stagnant until that changes. And the final suggestion regards the application and design of max patches specific to euphoniumists or low brass players. While fixed media works are often rewarding recital pieces, they're likely more abundant because of their technological simplicity. Systems that control live electronic works have a degree of complexity that is not as accessible to composers, and the complexity of max has been explained through online tutorials and forums. But a resource for euphoniumists specifically could be really beneficial. A guide like this could contain a basic introduction to commonly used objects, as well as how to create some of the most frequently used effects, such as reverb, delay, looping, and filtering. With these explained, composers and performers could feel more confident and competent to create patches, and perhaps this would inspire more live and interactive works. So, like I said, thank you to my committee and to the studio for being here and supporting me throughout this whole process. If you have questions, I suppose I can take those now. Otherwise, thank you all for coming. I appreciate you all listening and indulging me in this. And drive safe. Have a good night. Thanks.